Very nice to see a full lecture theatre. I think, judging by the constant flow of people coming into the theatre so far, there may be more, but I think we should also start. My name's David Corbett. I'm I teach here at the Courtauld, and I also work within the Centre for American Art that's located in the Courtauld, and that is part of, and that is hosting the event tonight. Just a quick word before we start about the organisation of the evening. Very quickly, after I've introduced him, I will hand over to the speaker, Altair Brandon-Salmon, and then he'll talk. We'll have a Q&A for 10 or perhaps 15 minutes, depending on how it goes. And then everybody is very welcome indeed to join us in the Research Forum seminar room, which is just a short step along the corridor in that direction, for a glass of wine and some more informal discussion. So let me introduce the speaker, Altair Brandon-Salmon, PhD student in art history at Stanford University, writing on how bombsites shaped post-war British art and architecture. His project, Strange Worlds, London in Ruins 1940-1994, shows that bombsites were portals into new urban experience, which created new ways of making art, advanced modernism into people's homes, and changed how people understood cities. An article drawn from his work on wartime ruins appeared in 2022 in the journal Art History. Well, I'll now hand straight over to Altair to introduce the lecture again.
Thank you, David. Wonderful. The old black and white photograph is of Adolf Hitler, asleep in his Mercedes. It's a strange image, denying the viewer any recognition of its subject. The man in the leather driving cap could be anyone at all. The photograph is a joke, a snapshot that shows all the things that can never be seen about ourselves, how we appear when we're asleep, or what the back of our head looks like. What captures the viewer's attention is the casual atmosphere of the image, immediately transporting us back to interwar Europe, where automobiles promised to collapse boundaries of time and distance, if it could be afforded. Yet casualness should not be taken at face value. The image is dense with details, thick with suggestion. The photographer sat in the back of the open-top Mercedes, took his medium format camera and, aligning it with the leading edge of the seat, shot the driver and the passenger, who were both unaware that they were being photographed. The driver is likely the SS officer Julius Schreck, Hitler's personal chauffeur. He's wearing a greatcoat, cap, leather gloves. He leans back, relaxed but alert. Up ahead, on the brow of the hill, there's an onion-domed church. A vast, lowering sky takes up half of the image, showing how exposed these figures are to the elements, open to the rain and wind. Hitler slouches over, asleep. The helmet-like driving cap depersonalizes him while its brim cuts into the Mercedes badge on the bonnet, a three-pointed star enclosed in a circle, emblematic of German automobile manufacturing. If it wasn't for the off-centered composition and the ambiguity of the two figures seen from behind, the photograph could be confused with an advertisement. The photograph promises intimacy. Couldn't I just reach out and touch his shoulder while withholding knowledge? This contingent moment happened, indexed by light passing through a lens and exposing a negative. It's the closed-off time on either side of the image, just before and just after, which appears unknowable and sends the photograph into the present. The image was taken by Hitler's personal photographer, Heinrich Hoffmann, in the autumn of 1932, in the run-up to that year's November election. At this point, Hitler is a political extremist, not yet the Führer. But it is impossible to separate the future from the moment captured by the photograph. The man in the leather cap will become the fascist dictator who will start the Second World War, murder 6 million Jews in concentration camps, and leave Europe a scarred wasteland. My knowledge of the future overpowers the image. The leather cap becomes a sinister disguise. The driver already seems to be in a military uniform. The Mercedes badge, redolent of the swastika and a reminder of the company's complicity with the Nazi regime. The transformation, though, of the photograph occurs wholly in my own mind. The image stays the same. This disturbing shift of meaning lay at the heart of Troy Brauntuch's debut solo show at the Kitchen in Chelsea, New York in 1979. He made a screen print of Hoffmann's photograph, blowing it up to 18 inches so that the halftone was made visible, and bathing it in a demonic red field. In the center was a degraded version of Hoffmann's image of a sleeping Hitler. On the far right side of the print, he cropped and highlighted the church. Exhibited on either side were 2 tall black wings. They're manipulated images of the light shows from the Nuremberg rallies. Nowhere in the exhibit did Brauntuch indicate the context of these photographs. Brauntuch's appropriation opened up the image's layers. Hoffmann's photograph, its subsequent reprinting, 1979 exhibition, which explored the gap between representation and knowledge. Brauntuch's maneuver foregrounded the instability of Hoffmann's photograph, forcing us to ask difficult questions. What happens when the audience shares Hitler's physical and mental space? What vision of humanity emerges? In the intermingling of the personal and the political, the installation made the audience complicit in fascism, while pushing them to ask what made them different, if at all, from Hitler. Within this ecology of Hoffmann and Brauntuch's imagery, I'm going to trace the photograph's evolution, showing how slippery representation can be. What enters into the gap between what I can see and what I know? The gulf that must be crossed forces the viewer to move beyond this immediate context in favor of wider questions about the signification of Hitler. The image is not deconstructive, but additive, where the different modes of Hitler's representation exposes how political power is translated into images. Photography accelerates the past into the present, making it impossible to safely bracket Hitler away. The audience is forced to see both his banality and humanity's capacity for cruelty. What are we to do when Hitler wakes up? Whose gaze am I sharing when I look at this photograph? It is Heinrich Hoffmann's, perhaps the most significant photographer of the 20th century, who shaped not only the representation of Adolf Hitler, but the spectacle of fascism more broadly. Born in Germany in 1885, his father was the court photographer to the King of Bavaria. Hoffmann came to London in 1907, working with the influential society photographer and photomodernist E.O. Hoppe at 7 Cromwell Place in South Kensington, before striking out on his own practice. He became a freelance news photographer, and in the wake of the 1918 Socialist Revolution in Munich, published a successful 1 Year of Revolution in Bavaria. In 1920, he became an early member of the Nazi Party, convinced, as he blandly put it in his post-war autobiography, that its, quote, program seemed to offer the only possible solution to the chaotic problems with which my country was overwhelmed. His ideological opportunism paid off. He was commissioned by an American press agency in 1922 to photograph Hitler, who had come to prominence the previous year as the Nazi Party's new leader. They became friends with Hoffmann as Hitler's only personal photographer up until the Führer's suicide in 1945. This created a corpus of 2.5 million photographs that were used in posters, newspapers, magazines, and special photo books celebrating the Third Reich. Once the Nazis gained power in 1933, Hoffmann became extremely wealthy. employing over 300 people in his photo agency. Amongst them was the receptionist Eva Braun, who Hoffmann introduced to Hitler and would go on to be his mistress. The intertwining of Hoffmann and Hitler's lives seems overdetermined, the photographer shaping the dictator. Yet Hoffmann invited such retrospective assessments of his work. On the 2nd of August 1914, German troops were mobilized. A huge crowd congregated outside the Theaterkirche at Odeonsplatz in Munich. The enterprising Hoffmann, 29 years old, photographed the masses singing The Watch on the Rhine. A young boy climbed up on one of the lines on the plinth to survey the sea of hats before him. The density of men and women palpably transports us back into their feverish excitement. In 1932, Hitler was in Hoffmann's Munich studio, reminiscing about the Great War, and came across the photograph. Hoffmann took out a magnifying glass and discovered him in the crowd. It was quickly published in the magazine Illustrierte Beobachter, a white circle identifying Hitler, proof of his patriotism and loyalty to Germany. That same year, the pair would drive in a Mercedes through the countryside. It was part of Hoffmann's self-image that he was always there at those crucial moments. The Odeonsplatz photograph is a doubled image of history, capturing the communal intensity of the impending First World War and somehow, incredibly, anticipating Hitler's own later significance. Profiled in the New Yorker in 1950 while he was still in prison for war profiteering, Hoffmann said that, "I often think of myself as basically an American type, enterprising, full of ideas for making money, always on the spot where big news is happening, not satisfied with anything but the best." This was as photography at its brashest, most self-confident and entrepreneurial. The photo books that were published throughout the 1930s and 40s constructed the enduring image of Hitler, a man always in front of crowds, greeting children and old people, dashing between meetings and automobiles and aeroplanes, strategizing with his advisors at Berghof. The spread of photographs in the brown-shirt army showed Hitler in his Mercedes, saluting a crowd, talking to injured veterans, and in a symbol of healing, grasping the hand of a man with a bandaged head. The touch of Hitler is everywhere in Hoffmann's imagery, recalling Antoine Jongreau's 1804 painting, Napoleon visiting the plague victims at Jaffa with his almost Christ-like powers of healing. This is stressed in a spread in Hitler Off Duty from 1937 that is captioned "The Hands of the Leader." 4 close-up shots of Hitler's hands, 3 of them cropping out the rest of the body, allowing the viewer to focus on his fingers, signing an autograph, pointing at a building plan, and drawing an architectural design. The images are pared down to only show the decisive action. Hitler was aware from his early years as the leader of the Nazi Party of the importance of visual imagery. He would often select photographs Hoffmann could publish, always attempting to portray himself as the Führer, both above the people but always within his people, a dictator who loved his dogs. So it's extraordinary that it was in an official volume that a photograph of Hitler asleep in his Mercedes was first published. The 1933 book, The Battle for the Third Reich, was released to mark Hitler becoming Chancellor in January of that year, and so it was even more luxurious than usual, with Hoffmann's photographs hand-coloured. Halfway through the book, there is a page of intimate shots of Hitler standing in front of a lake and talking to men around his car. There, in the upper left-hand corner of the page, is a cropped and coloured version of Hoffmann's photograph taken the previous year, captioned "Across Germany." It's a tiny image, meant to be taken in at speed. The Mercedes badge is hard to make out on the page. Only the red tint to the church's tower and roof makes it legible. Hitler's head is a mass of darkness. This is photography as kitsch and hagiography. The images are film. The windscreen operates as a screen unto itself, a rectangular frame across which a succession of views is unveiled as the car cruises along. Hoffmann's photograph is a cross between a still and a moving image, inviting the viewer to imagine the Mercedes in motion. Technologies of movement were central to Nazi self-representation, be they automobiles on autobahns, or Hitler descending through the clouds in aeroplanes, as in Leni Riefenstahl's film Triumph of the Will. Hoffmann spread balances between the immobility of the image and the propulsive implication of its caption, the photograph presenting Hitler as feather hurtling across the Reich. Hitler relished the experience of speed promised by Mercedes, telling Albert Speer in 1933 that Julius Schreck was the best driver you can imagine, and our supercharger is good for over 100. We always drove very fast. What fun we had teasing the big American cars. We kept right behind them until they tried to lose us. Those Americans are junk compared to the Mercedes. Their motor couldn't take it. After a while it would overheat and they'd have to pull over to the side of the road, looking glum. Hitler's delight in overtaking American-made cars becomes a crude analogy for the superiority of Nazi Germany's technology over its global rivals. The emphasis on momentum shows this perennial impatience. For Hitler, his dark blue 7-liter convertible symbolized his attitude towards political power. Hoffmann would sometimes act as his driver in Louis Schreck, while Hitler would always sit in the passenger seat, all the better to experience the thrill of the road. The spread in the battle for the Third Reich is an ideological presentation of Hitler as the everyman. The images show an innocuous bourgeoisie's holiday, so that his mystique is intensified, because the disguise is never meant to be convincing. It is also Superman, capable of terrifying destruction. Saul Friedlander sums up these two halves as death and nostalgia, an aesthetic frisson that insinuates itself inside the audience. When, over the course of Hoffmann's images, Hitler is transformed from everyman to Superman, this trick of representation leads to a magic moment where his power is revealed. Through Hoffmann's photography, Hitler is launched into the realm of mythology. The photograph of Hitler asleep in a Mercedes wouldn't reappear for decades. Hoffmann spent 5 years in prison after the Nuremberg trials and had his fortune stripped away. His archive was split between the US National Archives and Records Administration and the Bayerische Staatsbibliothek in Munich, and in 1957 died. In 1966, after serving 20 years in prison for war crimes and crimes against humanity, Albert Speer, who had overseen the Third Reich's armaments manufacturing, was released. Soon, his autobiography Recollections was published in Germany in 1969, and then translated into English in 1970 as Inside the Third Reich. Speer's book was a form of absolution, attempting to portray himself as an apolitical technocrat. Its phenomenal success speaks to the prolonged fascination with the personal lives of the Nazi high command in the decades after the war. An array of Hoffmann's images were reproduced, including a page showing Hitler touring Germany in his Mercedes. Speer's presentation is essentially the same as Hoffmann's, albeit more heavily cropped and printed in black and white. The date of the photograph, 1934, is wrong and makes the reader wonder how much they can trust Speer here. Is Hitler even really asleep? Perhaps he's just leaning over. Hoffmann's image makes more sense, though, as having been taken to capture Hitler sleeping rather than bending to the side. Photography for Hoffmann is about representing Hitler as a recognizable, not relatable figure. He sleeps, but he does not tie his shoelaces. The image could be positioned as continuing the German romantic tradition of the Rücken figure, the back figure that Caspar David Friedrich captured with Two Men by the Sea. While the battle for the Third Reich used the photograph to show Hitler traversing Germany as its leader, Inside the Third Reich deploys it to alleged intimacy. It is presented to satisfy what Roland Barthes called those details which constitute the very raw material of ethnographical knowledge. Here, the spread of images answers questions the reader never knew they wanted answered. What does Hitler look like when he sleeps? How close could people get to him? What does he look like at home? It's the voyeurism of evil. Hitler so disembodied as a figure of destruction that people turn to Speer's book and Hoffmann's photographs to remind ourselves that Hitler was human after all. Unsurprisingly, readers are never left sated. There's always more to see. His aura stays. Walter Benjamin, living in Berlin at the same time as Hitler, defined aura as a peculiar web of space and time, the unique manifestation of a distance, however near it may be. Hitler keeps his distance despite a constant repetition of his image. Viewers never get inside him. I'm drawn to another image of Hitler sleeping in Speer's book. The theorist slumped in an armchair, Eva Braun looking on attentively. Its mind-numbing prosaicness reminds me of Hannah Arendt's lesson of the fearsome word and thought-defining banality of evil. But the spectre of Hitler is still too strong to overcome. People never think he could be like them, despite all the evidence to the contrary. Only when they see him from behind, his head entirely covered, can we see Hitler without seeing him. It was in Speer's book that young Troy Brauntuch first came across Hitler in the Mercedes. For Troy Brauntuch, as an American teenager growing up in the 1950s and 60s, the war was everywhere. Not the wars in Korea or Vietnam. No, the war was always the Second World War. Books, comics, television shows, and most of all, films proliferated, representing the Allies' victory over Nazi Germany and Japan. Brauntuch was born in 1954, meaning that The Longest Day, The Great Escape, and Where Eagles Dare were part of his cultural background growing up in New Jersey. Nazis were fetishized figures their insignia, uniforms, and paraphernalia reveled in. Robert Brownjohn's title sequence for The Night of the Generals focused exclusively on the dislocated parts of a Nazi general's uniform emerging out of the darkness. The taboo on the Nazis were broken. They were now figures of mock horror. Brauntuch would later remember that, quote, cinema was really just amazing. So I think myself and others were sort of quite entrenched in film and image, certainly more than art. The photograph, the film still, the memories of a movie that slipped from its original narrative. These would all become an organizing principle for the first 2 decades of Brauntuch's practice. After graduating from the California Institute of the Arts in 1970 by conceptual artist John Bolsari, he headed to mid-70s New York. In 1977, he was selected by the art critic and curator Douglas Krimp to feature in the groundbreaking Pictures group show at Artist Space on 105 Hudson Street in Tribeca. Only 23, he was presented alongside Jack Goldstein, Sherry Levine, Robert Longo, and Philip Smith, who collectively established a new postmodern aesthetic that Krimp argued showed we only experience reality through the pictures we make of it. It was the new role of the artist to expose the structures of the image and to subvert its operation. At Pictures, Brauntuch displayed 1, 2, 3, a triptych of silk screens that showed, within an immense red field, fragments of drawings, a stage set, a vestibule, and a tank, each located in a different section of their frame, implying a larger perspectival construction. The tank is about to launch itself across the screen, while the arched hallway occupies the center of its composition, making the viewer instinctively try to fill in the image. There was no indication in the exhibition that these were drawings by Hitler. One had to read Krimp's catalogue essay to discover their origins. The before and after maneuver of Brauntuch, seeing the artwork and then discovering its hidden context, was from the beginning playful and malicious. The audience is made to participate in the work and then recoil in horror upon learning its origin, even if the drawings themselves are so fragmentary that there's a sense of being cheated. Brauntuch is always going to win this game. Not everything touched by evil is expressive of evil. Brauntuch's solo show at the Kitchen in 1979 intensified this strategy to transform the gallery space into a chamber of dreams or nightmares. This oscillation was emphasized at the very entry to the exhibition. A large 16 by 16 inch image hung in a black frame next to his name. Untitled Sleeping shows the back of a man's head while he dozes. At first, we might think this sequence is a blown up and cropped version of Hoffmann's photograph. Yet comparison shows that this image has been heavily manipulated. There's a streak of white light on the right, the cap has been exaggerated to look like a helmet, and the bare expanse of the neck is shrunk. It takes a while to realize that this is, in fact, a drawing based on the photograph, which has then been re-photographed and enlarged by Brauntuch. Photographs becoming drawings, which turn back into photographs. Crimp was right to realize that the young generation of American artists had no time for medium specificity. Everything was just pictures. More importantly, Brauntuch blurs the boundaries between his own practice and those of the artists whose work he appropriates directly in the exhibition, the photographer Heinrich Hoffmann and the painter Adolf Hitler. The head is both the avatar of the show and the world we inhabit. The landscape of images in the exhibition are all contained within his nodding cranium. At the far end of the gallery space was entitled Mercedes, which was flanked by a triptych of Hitler's architectural designs and two large reproductions of Hitler's drawings. Brauntuch would have known, via Douglas Crimp, or Benjamin's claim in 1932, the very same year as Hoffmann's photograph, that in a future, quote, the caption will become the most important component of the shot. By stripping away labels, Brauntuch destabilized the field of pictures. Douglas Eklund compared Untitled Mercedes to an altarpiece, the wings of light on black, cueing the audience to regard the installation as the summation of the show. The small repetition of the church tower on the right-hand side of the work emphasizes the ritualistic mode of approach, both a reference to the quasi-religious spectacle of the Nuremberg rallies and the sacralizing space of the white-walled gallery itself. With the installation placed at the far end of the gallery, it created a climax, drawing the audience in with the dry intensity of the red field. Yet the audience had merely returned to where they had started, with Hitler's head now smaller, even harder to make out, as though the picture was zooming away from the viewers. That's perhaps why he included the car's manufacturer in the parentheses of the non-title. It is the Mercedes badge which in the kitchen was the most legible of all the signs. The Mercedes badge is a pass the viewer can finally touch. Mercedes-Benz, founded in 1901, owes its present-day survival and success to an active collaboration with the Nazis, even before they came to power. Jakob Berlin, director of the Munich office, was friends with Hitler and had Mercedes automobiles provided for free or at vastly reduced cost to party members. It was Berlin who picked Hitler up from Landsberg prison in December 1924 in his own Mercedes after Hitler's failed push. 2/3 of the management were Nazi Party members, and their company became enormously wealthy from tax breaks granted to automobile manufacturers and from Germany's rearmament program. The construction of the Autobahn was the Nazis' flagship infrastructure project, designed for an open-top Mercedes to cruise along the smoothly curving roads, uniting the German nation. The Mercedes Reich, as it was nicknamed, utilized Jewish slave labor throughout the war to replace workers called up, using concentration camp inmates from Sachsenhausen and Ravensbrück. The Mercedes badge and the swastika were inextricably intertwined. This would have been in the minds of Brauntuch and his viewers. Hans-Martin Schleyer, a former Nazi Party member and Wehrmacht soldier, had become after the war a member of the Mercedes-Benz board. In 1977, the Red Army faction kidnapped him in Cologne and eventually murdered him. There had been no clean break with the past, but an endless continuity whose implications seemed impossible to disentangle. The critic Jean Silverthorne described Untitled Mercedes at length in Art Forum without realizing that it represented Hitler. She breaks down the clues but ruminates that, quote, looking so hard generates doubts about what is seen. As in Record's dreams, the more intense our pursuit of a scene, the farther it recedes. The work sucked in the viewer while refusing to divulge its secrets. I identify with the points of view represented, imagining myself to be the driver, or the photographer, or the sleeping man. Untitled Mercedes creates a widescreen experience, continuing Hoffmann's original framing of his images, being like film stills. The viewer's field of vision is filled in by the work, so that it becomes their will. Brauntuch wants to make the viewer complicit with the Nazis. The installation's glee was in its refusal to place Hitler in a special category of evil, and instead showing the collusion of representation. Brauntuch's maneuver serves to illuminate Hannah Arendt's idea that all prohibitions on behavior had been broken. Quote, what common sense and normal people refuse to believe, she said, is that everything is possible. Even an ordinary sleeping man can engineer a genocide. In the 20th century, there were no limitations left. Brauntuch's audience is forced to recognize that it belongs to the same spectrum of action as Hitler. Yet if Brauntuch accuses the audience of sharing the aesthetic, material, and even mental space of Hitler, then where does Brauntuch stand? The question of whether appropriation was critical or collusive was central to the debates over the picture's generation of artists. The dirty secret, of course, is that they were both. The entire point of Untitled Mercedes is that such neat separations are impossible. Art can reveal the fascism within us and within the artist. Brauntuch has subsequently struggled to coherently explain his own position towards his early appropriation of images by Hitler, saying, I used the drawings by Hitler based on a kind of repulsion attraction. I found them to be beautiful and interesting objects. The three images that I used were a Wagner opera set, a World War I tank, and a classical historical archway. I wasn't interested in Hitler in any way, nor did I even consider him as an artist. They were no different than an image or an object or a photograph of something. The contradictions pile up like a traffic jam, ranging between fascination and disavowal. In attempting to reduce Hitler's representation to the status of an image like any other, Brauntuch's representation instead allows the show to instead be quietly shaped by Albert Speer, who designed the Nuremberg rallies and whose memoir is the source of most of the images. In partially ceding control to Speer, Brauntuch ends up staging the enchantment of fascism, where the audience was surrounded by what Friedlander calls ravishing images, images one would like to see going on forever. The viewer loses themselves in the back of the head, bewitched. The distance Brauntuch attempted to create through his interventions are his attempt to control an obsession with Nazi imagery, which I think frightens him a little. How can he make Hoffmann's photograph pliant? Brauntuch is nearly successful in turning the photograph into a picture like any other, but there's something obtuse which remains beyond his grasp. Postmodernism, Craig Owens realized early on, will, quote, in the end affirm what it set out to deny. Brauntuch's desire for control creates an authoritarian environment, lacking in the most striking element of Hoffmann's photograph, the sleeping man's vulnerability. Hoffmann was good at the fast image, a photograph that could be immediately comprehended. Its essentials right there before you. His oeuvre is full of photographs where the emphasis on instantaneity becomes an advertisement for the medium itself. There's a photograph from 1933 of Hitler at the first Nuremberg rally since becoming Chancellor. He stands in his Mercedes, hands outstretched to the adoring crowd at Party Faithful. Hoffmann has even seen fit to retouch the Mercedes badge in the foreground for added emphasis. Political and corporate promotion are neatly combined. The image operates at the speed of the human eye. Yet there are other images which refuse to resolve at the quickened pace of modernity. Even more incongruous for being published in official Nazi Party photo books. In Hitler Off Duty, there's a 1937 photograph of the Führer with the family of Joseph Goebbels, the regime's chief propagandist. On the far right-hand side stands one of Goebbels' daughters. Next to her, Hitler sits near a piano while Joseph, his wife, and another daughter recline in small stacks. Within this opulent room, it is the vast swathes of negative space, particularly the expansive carpeted floor, that dominate the image. The daughter on the far right seems to be under interrogation. The furniture dwarfs all of the figures, even Hitler, and the lack of definition leaves the different elements floating in space. It exposes the false bonhomie of so many of the Berghoff images, the intermingling of Nazi politicians and their families, impossibly relaxed and benign. Here, the emptiness of the photograph creates a weird intensity where everyone is on edge. It becomes a sinister memorial when the viewer realizes that the Goebbels murdered their own children before committing suicide at the end of the war. The more slowly I gaze at the image, the more it overpowers its context in a propagandistic photo book. The slow image is animated by a different quality than the fast image, which is propelled by legible, unambiguous symbols. Roland Barthes in 1970 wrote an essay on what he dubbed the third meaning, that which lies beyond subject and symbolism. He designated this as the obtuse meaning. He demonstrates what he means with an act of image-based appropriation of his own. He took a film still from Sergei Eisenstein's film Ivan the Terrible and points to the obvious fakery of Ivan's beard that proclaims its artifice while maintaining a narrative coherence. As he puts it, this is a multi-layering of meanings that lets the previous meaning continue, as in a geological formation, saying the opposite without giving up the contrary. The ostensible meaning carries on while another force within the image, beyond language, operates in the viewer's eye. It creates a distancing effect, jerks people from the complacency of looking at images, which viewers are so used to, so good at, that it becomes an automatic talent. The obtuseness of a picture dissolves the false reality so convincingly created under normal conditions by the photograph in favor of something stranger, more frustrating. But helps me, I think, identify more clearly how Hoffmann's photograph operates. The obtuse value is the back of the dictator's sleeping head. Brauntuch clearly felt the same, highlighting it both in Untitled Sleeping and Untitled Mercedes, the only image in his body of work which he has returned to twice. The blankness of the driving cap doesn't tell me anything. Worse than staying mute, it works against me, not so much denying access to the Hitler I hold in my imagination, but denying even a basic recognition. What am I to do with this obtuseness? Roberta Smith, writing on Brauntuch in 1981, understood that, like the past itself, his images are hard to get at. This difficulty is the past's constant refusal to be contained within retrospective narratives, constantly throwing up confusing memories, utterances, and objects which cannot be assimilated into the stories we tell of what came before. Hitler's biographers do not dwell upon this image, but how can they use it? Mercedes-Benz would certainly rather you didn't remember that Hitler toured Germany in its cars, or that it helped build the V2 rocket. Brauntuch rescued the image from being forgotten, and in doing so exposed multiple histories sedimented into the grain of the photograph. Its obtuseness is at a sharp angle, which sticks in my eye. This attack on the viewer brings the image into the present tense, no longer just a historic artifact to be seen swiftly, but instead turns it into a confrontation, even as Hitler is moving away from us physically and in time. Barthes talks of obtuseness as a fold or crease, a gash that rises up above conventional networks of meaning. I think the metaphor that he approaches but doesn't quite arrive at is that the obtuse meaning is a scab, congealed blood of the past hardened and textured, something which hurts the more I pick at it, a bump that disrupts the smoothness of the body. This photograph is the scab of history. I am made aware of how the unresolved tensions of the past intervene in the present. A scab is a crust which forms over a wound. It's a personal bodily excretion that is absolutely necessary, and yet, like so much of what the body produces, horrifies and reminds me of my own fragility. The simultaneous hiding of the head under the cap and its exposure as the automobile speeds along, the lack of consciousness Hitler has in the moment as he sleeps. Do I project myself onto his head and worry for myself in his predisposition? Worry for him? The Hoffmann photograph is a rare image of Hitler where he is stripped of identity and power. In sleep, he has left this world. This intuition of another world hidden within the black hole of Hitler's head disturbs, for surely his dreams would be other people's nightmares. Brauntuch's Untitled Sleeping forces the audience to directly confront the dream world that Hitler slipped into. Douglas Eklund argues that the whole show at the kitchen, starting with that close-up, became a catalogue of Hitler's dreams. Without knowing it, the audience entered into his world. It is this sense of envelopment which returns me to the Mercedes in the countryside. I'm the one who sits in the back of the car. The power of the back of the head transcends time and distance. I'm sitting very close and I'm transfixed by this oval head. I'm moving very fast, the wind whips up my hair, and we are all on a terrible journey. The destination will be the mass graves of Europe, but I don't know yet how I'll get there. What is truly obtuse is when the visceral reality of the past erupts into the present. Hoffmann, released from prison in 1950, his fortune gone, decided to capitalize on his minor notoriety by writing a memoir, published in London as Hitler Was My Friend in 1955. Self-serving and exculpatory, it oscillates between claims to his own significance and his inconsequence to the Nazi regime. No doubt encouraged by the publisher's commercial demands, Hoffmann focuses on minor anecdotes about Hitler rather than his photographic practice. Yet the final lines of the memoir are curiously revealing. Quote, when a few pictures are pulled out to be shown as documentary evidence of this buried piece of European history to those future generations that were not there to live through it, then among them will be some truly historical photographs, ghostly transfixed fragments of history perpetuated by a man named Heinrich Hoffmann. He finally makes his bid for immortality. If I want to understand Nazi Germany, the Second World War, and the legacies which were already being buried in 1955 due to the Cold War's political exigencies, then I will have to turn to the images he made over a 25-year period. I would keep returning to this phrase, ghostly transfixed fragments of history, for it captures the precise quality that mesmerizes me today. I am repulsed, but I keep on looking. This hold both describes my own gaze and the process of photography itself, the moment isolated on the negative before being manipulated and transferred onto a print. It is what Brauntuch responded to when he saw Hoffmann's photographs in Speer's book. The banality of Hitler revealed by Hoffmann's imagery shows that he cannot be bracketed away from the rest of humanity. That is the disturbing charge at the heart of Hitler's Sleeping Mercedes, where art, and especially photography, stages its power to humanize, to make the audience relate to the environment created by the work. History exists only in its representation, so that the traces which trigger a viewer's recognition can powerfully transport them in time. There is something very human about the tilt of Hitler's head. He is not a singular abomination, but one of us, a recognition that forces us to consider how, under certain conditions, people are capable of any act of barbarity. Everyone Hoffmann photographed now has died. They live on in films and photographs, still yelling across parade grounds, marching down Champs-Élysées, pinning medals on the Hitler Youth as Berlin falls. Clive James wrote that these talismans of history offer, quote, instead of the solace of nostalgia, the bitterness of separation. Photography is powerless as art, but potent as magic. I don't need a spirit medium to conjure the dead when I have photographs of them. It's a bitter kind of magic, though, impoverished, two-dimensional. The colour not there, never quite right, easy to tear or stain. Susan Sontag thought that photographs look better the older they appear, instant antiques which become more interesting as they age. It's true because age foregrounds the object quality of the photograph, so that I can aestheticize it more easily. Yet all these accumulated marks of age serve to place the image itself at a distance. The bite of Hoffmann's photograph has not dissipated over the decades, as its central tension in the back of the head remains. The print may be flat, but within the grain are the layers of histories that have continued to shape the world. This photograph plays a dark trick on us by dissolving the past when we least expect it. We are all in the backseat of the Mercedes now. Hoffmann's photograph was a startling premonition that Europe was heading into the world that Hitler dreamed, a reality fragmented by modernity and destruction wrought by the intertwining of anti-Semitic fantasies and the latest technology. The photograph resides in the space between knowledge and unknowability, where history itself becomes what is always beyond our grasp. The photograph reminds us that we all now live in the world that Hitler dreamed.